Thank you guys for coming both here and on Zoom. It's nice to see you all. This is part of what we're trying to do in the econ department. We're calling it the Economics Ideas Seminar. We're trying to show what we're working on as faculty members, both to fellow faculty members and just as important to students, so the students know what we're doing. Hey, Pat. How you doing, Patty? Good to see you there. We want students to understand what it is that we do when we're not in the classroom. So I'm doing the first one, and this is part of the research that I'm doing on the evolution of Minnesota's economy. And in particular, one of the things that I've discovered as I've tried to tell the story of Minnesota's economy over the last 200 years is that the headquarters economy of the Twin Cities has been a driving force in economic growth over the last 70 years. The idea that a whole cadre of professional managers, of professional people who are involved in technology, developed, especially since the Second World War. But that prompted a question that I've dug into more, which is, well, wait a second, where did they come from? Okay, there's a professor down at the University of Minnesota named Miles Shaver who has argued that, there was this competent group of professionals in Minnesota in the late 40s and early 50s, and that's what led to things like control data and Medtronic and stuff. Well, where did they come from? He didn't answer that question. He simply took it as a given. So I've been trying to dig into that. That's how I got into packaged food, because I think that's where a lot of this starts. So here's what I'm going to tell you about. Let's see if the remote does what they're supposed to do today. There we go. So here's the big picture of my presentation. I want to first start with a few trends in the American economy, in particular how Euro-American agriculture evolved, especially during the 19th century. The movement from just processing raw materials to actually producing products like packaged food. The need for product differentiation within the packaged food industry, and then the role that grocery stores play. That's kind of the big picture. Then we'll zero in on Minnesota's role, and the place that I've really been spending a lot of time on, thank you, Tom, is General Mills. And in particular, one figure who you might be familiar with from visiting the Natural History Museum at the University of Minnesota, James Ford Bell. Well, James Ford Bell is actually the founder, creator of General Mills. And a lot of people don't even know who he is or what he is anymore. Very famous guy, very interesting guy, and I want to tell you a little bit about him. And then applying Bell's recipe means, I think he developed a 4-part recipe for professional food corporations that people are continuing to use even today. So I want to present what that is to you.
Nice use of the word recipe.
Yeah, you get it. So let's start, if the controls will let me. Oops. With the evolution of Euro-American agriculture, and I'm calling it Euro-American because, of course, before European immigrants came to what we now call Minnesota, there was plenty of agriculture going on of a variety of types. What I want to focus on is the kind of agriculture that European immigrants, European settlers, settler colonialism, if you prefer that term, practiced. And the two types that I want to zero in on in particular are what are sometimes called frontier agriculture, which involves self-sufficiency and what's sometimes called a vent for surplus, and what I'm going to call just commercial agriculture. We could be a lot more careful about this, but I just want to keep things at kind of a general level. Actually have people coming in, that's nice. So what do I mean by frontier agriculture? Well, if we think about the United States, and in particular if we think about the territory of the Old Northwest, we're talking about farms that are roughly 40 to 60 acres of working area. Now, they might actually own more land than that, but they usually involve about 40 to 60 acres of land that was cleared and actually either used as pasturage or for crops. And in particular, in that 40 to 60 acres, you would also raise animals, but usually for home consumption. So it was usually things like You'd have a few head of cattle, you might have a couple of hogs, maybe even have chickens or turkeys, but usually it was for yourself. It was not for the market. You'd also have a garden and an orchard, garden for vegetables, orchard for fruit, and then the cash crop that you would raise for the market would be wheat. So you'd have maybe 20 to 30 of those acres devoted just to this cash crop, so you could raise that, sell it, earn money, and then use that to produce the things that you can't produce at home. Please.
Do you want questions as you go? Or
let's do it, yeah.
So you talked about there not being a market in the usual way. I mean,
there is a market, it's whether they're involved in it.
Okay, okay. But was there barter?
Definitely.
So they, you know, if you had extra eggs, you could
definitely
give them to your neighbor in exchange for a couple of gourds of milk or something.
Exactly. So that actually is a real, I'm glad you asked that. That actually is a lot of what you see in this kind of frontier agriculture, is people trading services for goods, goods for goods, services for services. So classic example is raising a barn, or clearing land and fencing and things like that. We'll do it on year 40, then we'll go over and do it on year 40 or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of that going on. So it's not a cash economy in the strict sense of everything being bought and sold for cash or for money, if you want to say it that way. But there is a significant portion of it. That's why this is important. You are raising at least some of your crop, usually wheat, but also in some areas it can be corn. In other areas it might be fruit, depending on whether you're close to a big city, fruit and vegetables. But you're raising some kind of cash crop in addition to what you need to have home consumption. Now, contrast that with what I'm calling commercial agriculture. Commercial agriculture, the scale is bigger. So if you're talking about the 19th century, 160 acres or larger, depending on where you are and what time we're talking about. It's very diversified, even in the late 19th century. You've got crops, of course, you've got livestock, and I'm including dairy in there. You've got home production, but more and more and more of what you're doing is purchasing things outside the home for cash. So you're raising crops, selling them for cash, and then using the money maybe through the Sears catalog or through your local chain store or through the general store, depending on the level of the frontier to the settlement, going out and buying what you need. It doesn't mean you're not doing home production. You're still doing that. So, for example, you might be buying cloth rather than weaving it yourself. Or you might be making your own food, which in fact, that's part of the story here. You're making your own food, but you're not necessarily raising everything on your own farm. You might be going to town and buying things. So much more integrated into the market economy. Now, what about the Minnesota case? Well, if you look at the Minnesota case, we can be more specific. Basically, what you do is you have a transition from what was sometimes called king wheat, basically everything being involved in producing wheat for the market, to a variety of crops. The big ones in Minnesota being corn, oats, flax, starting in the 1920s, soybeans, fruit, especially in southeastern Minnesota, is very important, and vegetables. And livestock, cattle, hogs, poultry, including first chickens, later on turkeys. So that's what we're talking about. And to illustrate this, there's a wonderful book it was first published in 1960, went through a couple of editions through the 60s and 70s, called an Atlas of Historical Settlement in Minnesota. And, I forgot dairy and egg production, of course. Here's the percentage of land area that was devoted to wheat in 1879. So, for example, if you look down here, this is the original area of settlement for Minnesota, of European immigrants coming. They were mostly raising wheat in 1879. The reason this is light colored up here isn't because they're not raising wheat, it's because there just isn't that much European agricultural settlement. But as the railroads move this direction, you get more settlement this way, and by 1920, You've got wheat production over there. You've got some being grown down here, but basically they've gotten out of the wheat business. They now have moved primarily to corn, to dairy, to vegetables, to fruit, basically to a diversified agriculture.
So barley, rye, and hemp don't show up in any of this. Are those just niche products at that point?
They really are, except for certain areas. So for example, I wonder if this pointer works. Up in here, flax becomes really important. In this area, Stearns County, for example, barley becomes very, very important. And oats, in this whole southern half, oats is a niche crop, but it's very important, as you can imagine, because needed for horses. That's basically your fuel source.
And ginseng,
Ginseng is another one. Well, tobacco is a really fun one. And actually, that's why I want to do a plug for this book. This book is available now digitally. It's been scanned. It's got these maps that have all this stuff in there. It's got tobacco production, 1880 versus 1920. It's got corn. It's got flax. It's wonderful.
what's this book?
It's called Atlas of Minnesota Settlement. It's by John Borchert.
Oh,
So I can send you the link to it because the Legislative Library has it digitized now.
So is agriculture moving where railroad is constructed?
Exactly. So basically, this is the area of settlement. It starts down here, works up the Mississippi, and then goes in this direction. And here's where we are roughly. The railroad follows the Mississippi and then goes off in this direction towards what's now Fargo and Grand Forks and up into the Red River Valley. So you can almost see, if you had a time lapse, you could see the wheat production just getting darker going this way. And of course, if you had North Dakota and northern South Dakota and Montana, it would be really dark. That's actually going to be part of our story too.
Sugar is much later.
Pardon me?
Sugar beets is much later.
Sugar beets is much later. Sugar beets is until the 30s and especially the 40s. So, how does this become packaged food? How do we go from commodity processing, raising this stuff, to actually producing food products? Well, probably the most famous story is Pillsbury and Washburn Crosby developing high volume flour milling at the Falls of St. Anthony in Minneapolis. That's the one that most of us talk about in Minnesota. But that was just part of a bigger national trend. In fact, you could even think of it as an international trend in packaged food production. H.J. Heinz, the famous company that we know of for pickles and ketchup and things like that, they were one of the pioneers just after the Civil War in creating what came to be known as batch production. You basically take the processes that you use at home to make soup or to make pickles and scale them up. So instead of having, a pot on your stove, you now have a pot that's the size of this room. And you just have dozens and dozens of people cutting up vegetables the same as they would have and filling it with water, and it's literally the same process. But Heinz comes up with a way to scale these things up and then use modern techniques to can the product. Swift and Armour developed high-speed meat processing in Chicago. Today we think of assembly lines. This was the disassembly line. This is the idea of basically cattle coming in one end, sides of beef coming out the other. So Pillsbury and Washburn Crosby were part of this national trend of high volume production. Oh, and I almost forgot, Pabst in brewing, the same idea, very important. And I could include Anheuser-Busch in here too, but Pabst really was the leading company to start doing mass production.
Which year is this?
This is about 1880, 1885. They argue about it. That's why I'm laughing, because Anheuser-Busch says we were starting to do it in the 1870s. And brewing historians are kind of like, no, you really weren't. It was not like on the scale of Pabst.
They actually had to have the transportation and refrigeration possibilities to even make this feasible.
Exactly.
With all the scale that they had to have to reach the market.
Exactly.
Otherwise, they were stuck in a walk.
Exactly. And so There's a picture of Washburn. This is actually a stereoscopic picture of Washburn Mill. Thank you, that's a perfect segue to what I wanted to get to next. Notice right in front are railroad cars. In order to make this system work, you've got to have a transportation and communication network. You've got to have refrigeration in some cases. You've got to have the transportation. You've got to be able to take orders from long distances. You need all of that infrastructure that Alfred Chandler in his famous book, The Visible Hand, talks about, where you go from the invisible hand of market coordination to what he called the visible hand of coordination, which is what I just, some students who are on Zoom, that's what we were just talking about last week in our Econ 111 talk. So you needed that in order to have this system work. And of course, that creates a really big problem. You've got to maintain the demand for the stuff that's constantly coming out. You've got flour coming out, hundreds of bags an hour. You've got meat coming off the line. You've got beer. You got to sell this stuff. You can't just turn it on and turn it off. You've got to have the demand pretty stable. And you need the prices to be fairly stable too. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to cover the giant fixed costs that you've incurred of building a flour mill or building a giant brewery or building a giant place to make soup, your Campbell's soup or H.J. Heinz. So one of the things that they've come up with is the idea of differentiating what is coming out of these factories from other production facilities, what economists call product differentiation. And there's basically two ways that these companies start to do product differentiation. One is through branding and advertising. How is our flour different from somebody else's? Well, ours has this beautiful bag that says gold medal flour on it, or that says Pillsbury's best. And we can make a claim about it that it's purer, it's more finely milled. Ours is different, and you can start to connect that idea with customers by having brands, by advertising in national magazines, by having advertising throughout cities on big giant poster boards, what were called bills, where you just roll up a piece of paper on the side of a building, maybe even paint a sign. Another way, though, is through research and development. You actually do things to change the product. You have flour that looks like anybody else's flour, but you actually develop a process to enrich it with vitamins, or to add iron to it, or to bleach it so that it's really, really white compared to other kinds of flour. So product differentiation becomes a way to charge a premium. To say, we're not just the same as that other stuff. We're different. And, it costs a few pennies more, but you ought to buy ours. That's especially important when you add in the factor of how people are getting their foodstuffs, especially between about 1870 and 1914. The U.S. economy is becoming increasingly urbanized. And even if it's not urbanized in the sense of New York City, it's becoming more and more urbanized in the sense of people interacting with and living in even small towns. And they're buying more and more of their foodstuffs in grocery stores. And originally these stores sell bulk products. And they do sell canned goods, but it tends to be generic. So it's like, okay, it's canned oysters, or it's canned tomatoes. But with these companies like Heinz, with Washburn Pillsbury, with Pabst in beer, this is a different kind of story, but we're still talking about branded products. You start to see these showing up in these grocery stores. And probably the most famous of these stores, which some of us still remember, is the A&P, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. They were the first nationwide chain of grocery stores in the United States. And their basic model was you had a store where people would come in and there would be a counter around the edge. Outside the store, you'd have advertising. And you see a couple of brands here, but these are for A&P's own branding. Mostly you see bulk commodities. You see cane sugar. Here's another bag of it. You see 8 o'clock coffee, which still exists today. That's A&P's brand. That was the own brand that they developed. Crisco short, Crisco short. It was very much a system where the people who owned the store and ran the store would get the goods for you, pack them up, and then sell them to you on credit. That changes after World War I.
I have a question.
Please.
So A&P is a tea company. So
Well, that's
was,
the
so
name.
was, well, I mean, you said A&P tea.
The Great Atlantic
And,
is
right, and Jewel is another one. It was also Jewel tea.
Yeah.
What's the story with the tea?
tea. In the United States, tea shops were one of the earliest grocery type stores that specialized in the United States, as opposed to coffee, for example.
Mhm.
So even in Boston in the 1700s, you've got individual shops that sell varieties of tea. And so
And
A&P actually did start that
they
way.
were selling you sugar to put in your tea, and
Exactly.
not put in your tea. I see.
Exactly. Or don't you want some biscuits to
Uh-huh,
go,
right.
right?
I see.
Or don't you need some flour to make some cake to go with that?
Mhm.
You start stocking more of these commodities. One of the other things that A&P did too was they started stocking a variety of different herbs and spices, because it required much of the same infrastructure as tea in terms of the packaging, in terms of the weighing, and so they became centers for being able to buy any of your herbs and spices that you need. Please.
What's the date under A&P established?
1859.
And where economy rules?
Where economy rules. There's a wonderful book by a writer named Mark Levinson. It's called I can't remember. I'm getting it mixed up with one on Sears. Anyway, he's the author all about the history of the A&P in the grocery industry. And I strongly recommend it. It's one of those books that I think is fantastic, but yet I saw for years on the remainder too. I was able to pick up a copy for $2. That's the way life is sometimes.
So this over here, is the product differentiation happening at the wholesale or the retail level? So there's Crisco, is there also 3 other brands of Shelby in the end, or they only carry one?
You put your finger on it, it's at the wholesale level primarily. There's some at the retail, and that's where the flour companies are ahead. They're the ones who are early on actually product differentiating in retail, not just wholesale.
So will they stock multiple flour, or are you going to pick one you want?
Exactly. And in particular, what they do is you'll have multiple barrels of flour. You'll have ones that don't have any markings on it except it being flour, and then you'll have another one, as I've got a picture here, I'll show you in a few minutes, that actually has a gold medal label on it. It's like, oh, I want that barrel. I want the one that has a gold medal barrel. And of course, one of the things that leads to is Washburn Crosby salespeople testing. They go around and it's like, okay, is that really our flour in that barrel? And they're very strict about it.
So when the producers are in the wholesale marketplace trying to sell to their distributors, are they making claims about margin and profitability, or about quality and demand, or everything?
They're making it both. But that's also, I'm not getting into that here, but that's one of the reasons why you start to see chains like the A&P, because you integrate wholesaling and retailing and actually backwards into some of the canning and the production as well. So you have an integrated organization.
AMP has a distribution system also.
Yep. They have, in fact, they go so far as to have farms, dairies, coffee plantations, shipping lines they actually go in with United Fruit to do the fruit trade in Central America. They go all the way back to that end and all the way to retail. So by 1940, they're one of the biggest companies in the United States.
How regional are these products at the start? I would think it would take a long time to build a national.
It does. That's a question. Is a good one about that. I had the picture there. So that's 1859. You don't really see national chains here until the 1880s. And really the 1890s is when you start to see. A&P is pretty much confined to the area east of Chicago and north of the Ohio River until about the mid-1870s. They don't break out of it. I think their first store in St. Louis is until maybe the late 1870s. And they never really get to Minnesota. I mean, they get here, but they never penetrate because local chains start to come up. World War I and its aftermath, things start to really change. One of the first things that starts to happen is you get a move to what's called self-service. People picking their own items off the shelves. And what always surprises me, because I'm just, maybe I don't know enough, but whenever I read this, I'm surprised, a movement to cash and carry. The A&P before the First World War primarily worked on credit. You would settle up every week or every month, depending on the plan you are with the grocer. Well, the innovation after the First World War was not only would you pick it up off the shelf, but you'd pay cash for it right then and the transaction would be over. There would be no ongoing relationship with the grocer anymore. You could go wherever you wanted, pay cash, carry the stuff out, and never talk to them again. A very different kind of transaction. And it's taking place in increasingly urban and suburban locations, primarily with people getting there no longer on foot, perhaps even using streetcars, but instead you've got people getting there in their automobiles. So you have to start having parking, have to have rather large areas for that, with an emphasis on convenience. Can you pull up? Can you park? Can you get this stuff? Is there somebody out there to bag it, in there to bag it? So for example, here is one of the early Piggly Wigglies, which was the innovation of the 1920s. And notice you've got this cage here, basically. It keeps people out, mostly it keeps them in so that they pay first. But you can see over here, here's the items on the shelves. People have baskets. They can go around and pick what they want. And then you herd them into these lanes. Looks pretty familiar. Like Aldi. Pardon me. It's like Aldi. I visit my dog. This is, I don't know why it says 1918, because I know that this picture is actually from the 20s. But I visit my daughter sometimes in Madison, Wisconsin, and there's still a Piggly Wiggly in Sauk City, Wisconsin on the way to Madison. So I need to get a picture. All right, Minnesota. Been talking in general terms. Let's take a look at the Minnesota situation. Where the packaged food revolution really takes place in Minnesota is with the flour millers. And the way it takes place, I think, can be summarized by understanding a little bit about this guy. This is James Ford Bell. You can kind of see his personality coming out, I think, in this picture. You know, he's kind of smiling, he's got that cigarette holder, he's holding a paper, you know, it looks like he would maybe a telegram or something like that. He was a character.
And the signature.
Yep. This guy had personality, a lot of it. His story is very interesting, and I just want to see, okay. Yep. His father was recruited to be the head of the Washburn Crosby flour mills in the 1890s. His father was also named James Bell. He was primarily involved in the advertising of flour and the branding. He was the person who pushed the idea of gold melted flour. But the younger, who usually went by Jim Bell, at the time at least, he was known as, in his teens, as someone who liked to have a good time, as you can kind of imagine. He went to the University of Minnesota at 17, and he went over to what's now the St. Paul campus, what was then the farm school, ag college, and he met somebody who was very, very important in American processed food. His name was Snyder. There's a building named after him, Snyder Hall, at the University of Minnesota in St. Paul. He was one of the first people to do food chemistry. He's one of the first people to devote efforts to understanding the chemical composition of things like flour, of vegetable oil, of meat products, and look at them not just from the perspective of a miller or a butcher or a brewer, but from the perspective of a chemist. And Bell Jim Bell was fascinated. And so he majored in chemistry. In fact, his specialty was food chemistry. And one of the first things he did after he graduated from college is he went to his dad and said, I really want to work for Washburn Crosby. And his dad's like, fine, great. What I want you to do is go out and start selling flour. So he sent him to Michigan as a salesman, but that worked out fine. He was doing okay, but he soon wrote from the road, Dad, what we really need is research. We need a lab. We need to come up with new stuff the way that Snyder's doing in St. Paul. And so the first step in his recipe was to build on his dad's work, do more branding, do more marketing, build up the gold medal flour name. So here's an example of those barrels. Jim Bell, James Ford Bell, pushed the idea of even more brand product differentiation in the stores. So like you were talking about there, don't even worry necessarily about the wholesalers, go after the customers, go after the retailers. Start selling flour in 10-pound bags rather than just 50-pound bags. Don't just have it available in barrels or these giant bags. That was one of his big things. Another one was we need to start advertising in not only in national magazines, but in small regional newspapers. We need to put ads in any newspaper in which we can buy space. We want this name everywhere. And when he became president of the company in 1921, there's this newfangled invention, radio. Wow, we could start advertising gold medal flour on the radio. We could tell people about it. And in fact, by 1923, they have their own radio station. Call letters are WCC, Washburn Crosby Company, which basically is there, to start selling Washburn Crosby products. So, research and development is the next piece that I want to talk about. So branding and marketing and all that kind of stuff is very important, but research and development is also important because, okay, you can keep producing flour, you can try and differentiate your flour from somebody else's, but is there anything else that you can do with this? And one of the things that they start doing is they start experimenting with breakfast cereals. The Kellogg organization, the Post organization, both in Battle Creek, Michigan, they're proving the durability, the desirability of these newfangled grain-based breakfast cereals. Bell says we need to start trying that ourselves. And they come up with their own. Here's the original box of Wheaties. Whole grain cereal, linking it, of course, made with gold medal flour. This isn't just any old cereal. This isn't like Kellogg's and its corn flakes. Who knows what kind of corn that is? This is a cereal that's made with the flour that you can trust. And so, not only do you have research and development to develop this, you now go back to the branding and advertising and push it. You have national advertising campaigns in print. They develop what's called the Wheaties Quartet, which becomes one of the most famous musical acts of the mid-1920s. They're on the radio 3 times a day on WCCO, and eventually they go national on the NBC Red Network. They start touring. They start sponsoring radio shows. Some of you might remember Jack Armstrong. Might have heard of that. One of the more famous radio shows of the 30s. You start linking that name. And that brings me to connections with consumers. Consumers start to think about this. They start to associate Washburn Crosby with good stuff, right? Wheaties, oh, that comes from them. I wonder if they have anything else. Maybe I should look for that brand on other things in my grocery store now that I'm picking my own stuff off the shelves. I'm no longer just letting the clerk back there pick. I'm picking it off the shelf and I'm looking for those particular kinds. And so branding, radio, new innovations from research and development. Kind of hard to keep all that together. It'd be nice to have one name that you can remember. So you develop a personality, Betty Crocker, to represent your company. Because Betty Crocker, well, here's the original one. This is actually from the 1920s. This is the 1936, it says out here, but this actually was developed back, I think, in 26. She's a person, right? You can write to her. You can ask her questions. How do I make this particular kind of pie crust? I can write to the Betty Crocker Kitchens, Minneapolis, Minnesota. She provides recipes on the bags of flour. Just to go back here for a second, for a while, she's on the Wheaties box with ideas for things you can do for Wheaties other than just eating them as breakfast. It personalizes the company. It goes from being this kind of amorphous, big outfit to being associated with that person. So that's the third step in the recipe, connect with the consumers. The final part, I think, is the part that doesn't get nearly enough attention. These first three, there's a lot of good work that's either being done or been done about this. There's a whole area in history right now called the history of nutrition capitalism, or as some people call it, from calories to carbohydrates. There's a professor, Mike Lansing, down at Augsburg, who's writing some really great stuff about that. They really emphasize those first three. But I think the fourth one is equally important. And this is where I think James Ford Bell is critical to the story. Bell is no different than anyone else in terms of the branding and marketing, the research and development, the connections to customers. And what I mean by that is, there are other people who are doing that at Heinz, at Campbell's, at Quaker Oats, at Kellogg's. They're doing those things. Maybe Bell's a little bit different. What Bell early on does, though, in the 1920s is two things associated with professional management. First of all, being, as he calls himself, a college man, he starts looking for college-educated men all over the United States. And in particular, he starts hiring business professionals from Harvard Business School, from the University of Chicago, from Dartmouth, and especially from the University of Minnesota. He is out there, and his people are out there looking for college-educated men, and in some cases women, mostly men, to manage the day-to-day operations of this company. We're not going to just promote people. We're going to go out and find the best accountants, the best marketing people, the best cereal chemists. He's got memos where he lists this all off. I want cereal chemists who have worked with these people. Very specific about that. That's the first thing. Second is that he has an insight in the mid-1920s that I think really made a difference to Minnesota's economy more generally. He convinces the board that what really matters for creating wealth for both the stockholders and, of course, the people who are running the company itself is let the flour milling go wherever it wants. If flour milling dies in Minneapolis, we don't care. We don't need to keep the mills here as long as we own them. As long as we've got the headquarters here in Minneapolis with the accounting, with the legal, with the marketing, that's what matters. The other stuff is low margin, relatively low wage work, and it can be in Kansas City, Buffalo, Chicago, Helena, Montana, wherever it needs to be, we're just going to let it go. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because usually the story is told in Minnesota history that the flour milling industry collapsed in Minneapolis. Oh, it's so terrible. It didn't collapse in the sense of, oh my God, it's collapsing. And let it go. Pillsbury didn't so much on the other side of the river, but General Mills consciously said, this isn't worth doing anymore. But they didn't get out of the flour business. They bought up other companies all over the United States to create a new company, General Mills. You merge together a whole bunch of other companies and put the headquarters in Minneapolis. Or in 1957, you move it out to the suburbs in this brand spanking new gleaming headquarters out in Golden Valley. This is what's now 394 along there. This is what's now Highway 169. Notice all these open fields here. Here's where Shillard and the interchange and all that kind of stuff is all right there. In fact, General Mills covers all of this with buildings too. This was originally just a flat parking lot like that. Back here, this is the research department. This is where Betty Crocker Kitchens and the research department are located so that they're next to the people who are doing the accounting, who are doing the sales and the marketing. They're all in one spot. The idea is to bring them all together on a corporate campus, not have them spread out all over Minneapolis, put them all together in one place. There's another company that sees this going on and says, we got to do that too. 3M. Within a few years, they're building almost the identical thing on the east side of St. Paul for exactly the same reason. So, the flour mill into the first. James Ford Bell creates this 4-part recipe, but they're not the last, because there are other food processors, commodity processors, who are looking to diversify and become food producers in Minnesota. Meat packers, for example, the area around South St. Paul, but also down in Austin. There's a little meat packing company called Hormel. They start hiring people from General Mills. They start hiring food chemists. They start hiring professional managers. They start hiring marketing people, and they start developing their own products like Spam. Probably one of the most famous things to come out of Minnesota. Dairies. They start working together. It's a slightly different model because it's a cooperative, but probably the most famous of all those is Land O'Lakes. They follow the same recipe. I use that on purpose. You're right in there. It works. You start having branding, then you start having research and development to improve the quality of your butter. They start switching from sour cream to sweet cream. They're one of the first companies to start using that to mass produce butter. They develop that process in their own labs. They develop a home economics department that has a person at it. I can't remember her name now, just like Betty Crocker. And they start hiring professional managers from especially the University of Minnesota, the University of Iowa, Iowa State, and the University of Wisconsin. And of course, one of my favorites that I've been trying to write about a lot lately, this is the one that I've been spending a good chunk of time this fall when I've got time, trying to look at canning. Green Giant. Green Giant starts in 1904 in Le Sueur as the Minnesota Valley Canning Company. And by 1910, they have decided we're only going to pack 2 things, peas and corn. That's it. That's what we know how to do. That's what we're going to do. In the 1920s, and in particular in 1926, the head of the company takes a visit to England and he sees these giant peas that they're screwing. And he's like, these are really good. But in the United States, little tiny peas are the ideal. Is there a way I can convince people to eat these big peas? Because I think these are really good. So he goes back. Green Giant has already developed their own research and development lab. Brings some samples. They develop a Minnesota and Wisconsin hardy version of these large peas, started growing them on experimental plots. And by 1928, they're growing them commercially. You need some way to get that across. So they go to this advertising guy in Minneapolis who's kind of a rookie. His name is Leo Burnett. Nobody knows who he is. And I don't know if you've heard of Leo Burnett, but it becomes one of the largest advertising agencies in the world. They say, we need a name for this. And he says, well, they're green and they're giant. Let's call them Green Giant. And he goes to a book of fairy tales and picks this picture up, which doesn't do so good at first. So by 1930, he's turned the whole guy green. Takes off. Follows James Ford Bell's formula. You start branding everything with that Green Giant. So even though the company is called Minnesota Valley Canning, in 1930, this guy is showing up on both the peas and the corn. Even though the corn, the brand name is Niblets, which is the other thing that comes out of their research lab. A vacuum-packed can of corn with almost no water in it, unlike the other brands. So that by 1950, right in here, they changed the name of the company actually to Green Giant. It's no longer Minnesota Valley Canning. One reason I'm so interested in Green Giant is because they really stumbled in the 1960s. They were way behind on frozen vegetables. They didn't get into it until 1960, when already Bird's Eye and other companies were going like gangbusters in the 50s. And then instead of diversifying their vegetable production, which they did somewhat, they decided to diversify the company. So they started buying a restaurant chain here. They started garden centers. They started, they bought meat packing plants. And they tried to diversify the company. And by 1976, they were in really deep trouble. So in 1978, they get purchased by Pillsbury. And in 2001, Pillsbury gets purchased by General Mills. So General Mills now owns Jolly Green Giant. Actually, they sold off the Jolly Green Giant in the last few years to a company in New Jersey. Can you believe it? Jolly Green Giant now lives in New Jersey. So that's my story, at least as we are now. That these trends in American agriculture, combined with unique things that are going on in Minnesota, led to Minneapolis, St. Paul, but Minnesota more generally as kind of a hub of the packaged foods. So, what do you think?
It strikes me that this story is peculiar.
Turn the chat on.
Is American. As in Europe, even though you began your story with European settlers, even now it's not so easy to find a supermarket.
Mm-hmm. It is.
In Europe.
And one of the things that I think is especially interesting, if we go back here, go from the slide back, Green Giant, for example, they were able to do really well in the 1950s by introducing canned vegetables in England. They were able to make a huge splash there, and part of it was because American GIs were familiar with this stuff. They had it, or they got it as a gift, and it started to make its way to British households. So Green Giant was the first, but you go back here, Land O'Lakes eventually started going global. This became, of course, very important with World War II. And General Mills, they were already in Europe before the Second War. So it's a particularly American story. And I think it's particularly Upper Midwest.
It was something that ask an economics question.
Please.
I mean, sort of, so sort of three questions. So this question of output and productivity, right? So what is the question? What is the contribution of the packaged, not the packaged food sector in the Minnesota economy, in terms of the GDP, the state output, and the labor or employment?
Right.
And then to what extent, I know you have a lot of interest in sort of the trade side of this. Mine's curious because it's been several months in the Philippines. The meat consumption in the Philippines is centered around canned meat.
Oh,
It's not fish, it's
canned meat.
because of storage costs. And spam, of course, is the expensive type. But so the question is how much exports, either to internationally or domestically? How much of that are we shipping out?
I should know that, but I don't, that's the top of my head. But the earlier question about the productivity is really, that's in a way how I got started on some of this. Let me just scroll back here a little bit. I'll tell you a little story. So I really started getting into James Ford Bell because I learned about an organization called the Minnesota Resources Commission that was appointed during World War II to look at the future of the Minnesota economy. And the chair, who the governor appointed, was James Ford Bell. And I only heard of James Ford Bell as the guy whose name was on the History Museum and also had a rare book collection at the University of Minnesota. So I started going through his papers. It's incredible. And one of the things that he commissioned as head of the Minnesota Resources Commission was a study of output, labor input, capital input, and productivity down to what today we would call the 3-digit SIC level for Minnesota. That as far as you could go. Wow. So for example, productivity in branded packaged products was somewhere between 2 and 3 times what it was for generics. On value, using the numbers. And so one of the recommendations of the commission was we need to do a lot of that. We need to stop just packing peas and we need to have green giant peas. Makes sense. So that's getting at your question, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I can't remember the trade one, I can't remember.
But the share of our economy now, how much of our economy today is agriculture is a small subset.
Agriculture is tiny.
But food production or food processing.
Food processing is by value, I think, either the second or the third biggest industry in manufacturing.
Right.
Within manufacturing. Biggest is medical devices by value, not surprisingly. And then the one that always surprises me still is printing and publishing. I think because of West Publishing still being so, Thomson Reuters, being so important and legal, but I'm still surprised that that's still number 2 or number 3. But the trade one's a good question. I don't know. You should look at that. You guys are way
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, you presented this development from the company's point of view.
Yes.
But it seems to me that the public also drives it in how they change. So how is the public change that drove this history?
I actually am glad you asked that question because I'm doing this on purpose because what I found in the history literature and in what we might call the American Studies literature, it's almost entirely from the consumers, from the household's point of view, of thinking about things like, how do women come up with new ways of satisfying their families for food? Or if women are starting to work outside the home for pay, how do they take care of feeding their families and things like that? And so almost all of that literature is from the household point of view. There's almost nothing until you get into the business history literature that talks about the corporate side. And so that's why I was telling you that. But from the consumer side, where do you want to start? One of the big ones is the movement in basically starting after the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, but certainly picking up steam after the First World War, that packaged food is more pure and healthy than raw food or just processed food. So for example, it is better for you to buy a cake mix than to buy the ingredients of flour, baking powder, and things like that, because I don't know what the purity of those things. Unless you buy gold medal, right? Unless you buy the branded kind, it's better to buy Betty Crocker's cake mix. Or, you could make your own biscuits, but it's a hassle. You don't have enough, you're modern women, you don't have enough time, right? Let me give you this box called Bisquick. It's already got the fat in it, it's got the flour and the baking powder all measured out. All you need to do is add a little milk or water or whatever different regions have different styles of biscuits, whatever proportions you want. There you go. So there's a lot written on that, and I could spend way too much time on it. But yeah, there's a lot. Basically, that dovetails with the branding and marketing. There's a huge amount of that going on, where not only are you trying to product differentiate, but you're trying to convince people, basically women, you should use this stuff. It's really good. My mom, I know, is watching right now. She used to make a joke when I was growing up that everything we had at our house was home mixed or home opened, because that's what you do. You do
Well,
that
the
stuff.
marketing was so focused on women. I mean, that was the audience that they were advertising to, which I think is really interesting. Excuse me, Kurt.
That's all. You may have just answered my question, but I wanted to ask about if Bell's Recipe, for example, positioned these companies well for the transition from package to process. So going from buying a can of peas or bag of butter, buying a TV dinner,
Yes.
frozen cake, etc. So are they all well positioned in to fit these forward to
The short answer is yes. And so that's actually another thing that I've been looking into is, were they able to make the transition into those kinds of foods? And that's where I think Green Giant really stumbled. General Mills was able to do that. They were able to go from cereal and things like Bisquick and cake mixes into hamburger helper, right? And things like that. It was interesting, in the paper on Friday, Star Tribune broke the story that they're going to be selling off the Helper brand.
Yeah.
They're going to be selling all that off along with Progresso Sweets. But you know, it did position them. And outside directors at Green Giant said, you know, you ought to be making frozen vegetables in a bag with carrots and peas and these mixes so that someone can just have it. And they're like, nah, we don't do carrots. We do peas and corn, and that's it. And really slipped them up. And I think it did Hormel for a while until the late 1960s, when they got some new management that argued, or that pushed the idea that, you know, Dinty Moore stew is not just a byproduct. This is something we can really sell. And Mary Kay kitchen hash isn't just a byproduct. This is something we can really push. And they did. And that's when they started going into dehydrated bacon, you know, the shelf-stable bacon, shelf-stable meals, all that kind of stuff. That's when they really started pushing into becoming a food company.
I recently met a woman who was one of the Betty Crockers. Yeah, we were talking about it, took a picture and something. And she sort of looks like that, and what they did, of her generation, is they took photos of about 15 different women and pulled them together to make Betty. But then they sent them out.
Yeah, this one I remember especially reading about. This is a composite, 1972. That one, like you said, it was like half a dozen people, dozen women.
Yeah, so they'd say, well, do you want to go to Chicago this week? So you go be Betty this week, and you go be Betty this week. And the care with which they did that is just astonishing.
And there was one woman who, I can't remember her name now, who was always the voice of Betty Crocker starting in the late 1920s. She was in every commercial, she was on every radio program, and even if it had to be recorded, because you couldn't have a different voice. I would mess everything up. When did food safety start to get integrated? Oh, that's a good question. So that's from Jane. Hi, Jane. Or no, or, is that Pat? That's Pat. Sorry. I think it's, from what I can tell, Bell, that was one of the things he wanted to be careful, Washburn Crosby, later General Mills, he wanted them to be a leader in that. He very much wanted purity, safety, high standards to be one of the things that they were known for. And so they were one of the earliest companies to invite USDA inspectors into the flour mills. Pillsbury resisted it. They didn't want them in there, but Washburn Crosby basically said, sure, come on in, we'll show you everything. And so that was something that they could put in their advertising. That was before the First World War. And that's actually another interesting thing about I was just going to look at the participants here. I can hear some. No, slipped. That's what happens.
Well, a really interesting thing that's happening on farms in this period, which you can trace in the agricultural censuses, are the ways in which farms stop producing so many other things. I mean, honey,
Exactly.
all of these products that they made at home, brooms, they just gradually fade away.
And then that cash, being connected more and more with the cash economy, that you raise cash crops in order to go and buy stuff, especially after the First World War. I don't know if that shows up in the census, but the documents that I looked at, that's where it really is. It's in the 20s, you just start to see that. Gosh, I wish I could remember. That was another thing that I haven't mentioned in here, but is a little known little factoid. I love little factoids. Here's another part of James Ford Bell's recipe that I didn't mention. Grocery stores. Anybody remember Red Owl?
Oh, yeah.
That was General Mills.
Yep.
They started in the 1920s. And it was James Ford Bell III who started. His father gave him a stake, and they started the Red Owl store, and it was an independent chain from 1922 to 1967. And one of the ideas was, here's another way that we can have an outlet for our products, either with our name on it or with the Red Owl brand. And
who's Safeway?
Safeway is on the West Coast originally. Yeah.
But the economics, so they didn't keep that though. So the vertical integration at that level didn't.
No.
He was managerially too challenging to keep that.
Yeah, by the late 60s, they decided that just didn't help. It was better to just go through the existing channels. So they sold it to another Minnesota company called Gamble's, which if you grew up here, you probably know about Gamble's, Kokomo. They actually started in Fargo, but originally the first store was in St. Louis. First Gamble's was downtown in St. Louis. And they bought up Red Owl, and they also bought up a drugstore chain called Snyder's, and had those for the next, till the early 1990s.
So did Dayton and Target follow any of this recipe?
I don't think they did. I think they did in the sense of that they have branding, marketing, and connection with consumers, but I haven't found much evidence that they were looking at what was going on at General Mills. I have found that 3M was keeping it they were keeping tabs. They were watching what was going on. But from what I can tell, Dayton's was looking more at Kresge, and they were looking at what was going on with the malls, what was going on with Sears, of course. And in a sense, looking at where could they compete in niches where Sears wasn't. So in terms of quality, that was better than Sears. Or in terms of items that Sears just didn't carry. That seemed to be where they wanted to position Target, especially in the early 60s. So for example, you couldn't get groceries at Sears. So the early Targets had groceries right out of that, which they got rid of in the 70s and then brought them back again in the 2000s. Well, I was going to say, you suffered through an hour. Thank you very much.